Hi, I'm Terry Dunne. I'm Clare County Library's historian in residence, and over the last while I've been working on a research project into land and revolution in County Clare and County Laois, funded by the Royal Irish Academy under the Decade of Centenaries programme. The Rent Ledger is a very important document for understanding Irish social history, and Clare County Library Local Studies hold a rent ledger from the estate of Henry Valentine McNamara for the early 1900s. What the rent ledger did was record which tenants held which farms and how much rent they had to pay for them. When you see the big houses, the palatial mansions of the landed gentry, it was the rent ledger that paid for all that. This documentary is about the estates of Henry Valentine McNamara, George O'Callaghan Westrop and Lucius O'Brien. Now, Lucius O'Brien's estate in County Clare was actually mostly managed by his brother Edward O'Brien. Between the three of them, on the eve of the Irish Revolution, they owned tens of thousands of acres in County Clare. All three were leaders of the County Clare Unionist Club, and all three were descended from ancient Gaelic lords. The O'Callaghans had a 10th century King of Munster as an ancestor, and they had been transplanted from Cork to Clare in the 17th century. McNamara means son of the sea wolf, an appropriate name for a family that supplied sons to be officers for the Royal Navy. The O'Briens were descended from Brian Boru and the legendary Máire Rua of Lamina Castle. All three had their troubles with the Irish Republican Army. George O'Callaghan Westrop stoutly resisted when local volunteers came to seize his guns from his mansion, Maryfort, near Tulla. Henry Valentine McNamara ended up in a full-scale skirmish when he was out hunting near Carron, while in May 1921, Rosslevin, on the outskirts of Ennis, erupted into gunfire with a shootout and a car chase, all after an IRA unit interrupted a tennis match at Edward O'Brien's house. But what is recorded in the rent ledger is a more silent revolution. Once we get to 1920, you can see the entries in the arrears column grow as people are not paying their rent. One dimension of the Irish Revolution on the land was rent strikes. Another was cattle drives. Another was wage disputes. We're going to be looking at all three. But there was another dimension, perhaps a more conservative dimension, which was the Irish Farmers' Union. And perhaps surprisingly, a number of its leading figures were people who came from landlord backgrounds, including George O'Callaghan Westrop. This is the rent ledger, or one of the rent ledgers of the Henry Valentine McNamara estate. And when we see the big houses and the palatial mansions of the landed gentry, well, the rent ledger is what paid for all that. And what this does is record what tenants held which land and how much rent they owed for that land, yeah? And what we see in the rent ledger for 1920 is the beginning of a silent revolution in that you see rent arrears go up because people are starting to not pay their rent. And one of the things that characterised the Irish Revolution on the land was rent strikes. So we're going to be talking about rent strikes, but as well as rent strikes, you have wage disputes, cattle drives on disputed land. Cattle drives just meant removing stock off a disputed property, returning it to its maybe the front garden of the owner. In the west of Ireland, one of the main focuses of social conflict was what was known as untenanted land. Untenanted land was land that was rented out for 11 months under what was known as the 11-month system, or conacre. There was about 10,000 acres of this in County Clare. The land was let out annually to the highest bidder, and so it was perceived as being monopolised by a wealthy set of graziers. But perhaps it wasn't the acreage that was so important so much as the lack of any other means of making a livelihood other than the land. So the question really was bovines or Boston. If you didn't have access to land, you were going to have to emigrate. On the microfiche machine here, we can see the newspaper cuttings made by Lord Dunboyne, who was resident in Nepole Castle, and they run from 1824 up to 1873. And in these newspaper cuttings, we can see lots of the processes of social change and social conflict that happened across the 19th century and led up to the phenomenon of untenanted land that was in contest in the early 20th century. They run across the middle decades of the 1800s, from the 1820s up to the 1880s. And in them you can trace how common resources subject to customary control were turned into commodities that could be bought and sold, like the untenanted land of the 11-month system. So in Lord Dunboyne's newspaper cuttings, first we can see the turning ups of the 1830s, which is where crowds of people would go out and dig up pasture land, which was being used for the cash crop of the time, which was beef cattle for export. They dig it up so as to force its use for potato ground, growing the subsistence crop for the local food supply. The backdrop for that is the growth in grassland from 1850 onwards, because that is where the money was. And then you can also, in Lord Dunboyne's newspaper cuttings, see the seaweed riots of the 1840s, where the common resource of the seashore, seaweed, which is the greatest natural fertilizer for growing crops, was to be privatised and turned into something that people who previously had a customary right to had to pay for. Then, after the famine, we can see in Lord Dunboyne's newspaper cuttings the assassinations of new landlords who came in under the Encumbered Estates Act. And of course, it was clearances during the famine itself which played a major role in creating the untenanted land of the 11-month system. There's posters in here for everything that was auctioned in East Clare over many years, but what I'm interested in is the auctioning of untenanted land under the 11th month system, which was a major focus of social conflict in early 20th century Ireland, particularly in the west of Ireland and the North Midlands, the traditional beef areas. And so untenanted land was auctioned off every year and in 11th month lettings, and it was perceived as being dominated by a wealthy set of graziers. So we're immediately into a story that's more complex than the people of Ireland and the landlords. There was 10,000 acres of untenanted land in early 20th century Clare, but you know, it's not just a matter of some people possessing a lot of land and some people possessing a minimum amount of land. It's also a question of what other livelihood was there other than the land. So there's two interesting things about this poster that speak to what I'm talking about. First of all, you'll see it's being let for 11 months, and that's the 11th month system, which was favoured by landlords, a shorter seasonal tenancy, which was the way so-called untenanted land was let out, because you had less rights as a tenant in terms of legislation if you were renting for less than a year. So it would be auctioned off seasonally to the highest bidder. And these are the sort of lands that were perceived as being monopolised by a wealthy set of graziers, many from urban social groups such as merchants or shopkeepers. And the thing is, in this poster, the lands are in northeast Clare, but the auctioning is in Limerick. At least the auctioneer's office is in Limerick. Stylistically, I really like these posters. Obviously at the time they had to use a lot of interesting fonts and colours because they didn't have cheap printing for photography like we do now. So this was a way of attracting an audience. In 1923, on the O'Brien estate centred in Dromoland, its owners faced a multiplicity of demands reflective of the multiplicity of classes in rural Ireland. There were tenant committees putting forward demands for rent reductions and for tenant purchase. in 6 Mile Bridge, Newmarket on Fergus, Dora, Clare Castle and Carfin. The Newmarket on Fergus Irish Transport and General Workers Union branch was trying to maintain wage rates on the O'Brien's home farm in Dromoland. And in Lemena, in the north of the county, there was 1,759 acres of untenanted land centred around Lemena Castle, the historic 17th century castle of the O'Briens. And that untenanted land was subject to cattle driving and what was known at the time as illegal grazing, which means that surrounding small farmers had taken possession of those lands. Just down the road from Lemena Castle is a roadside memorial to Albert O'Brien. Albert O'Brien was shot dead in February 1923. He was shot by the Special Infantry Corps. The Special Infantry Corps was a gendarmerie-style unit of the Free State Army, set up early in 1923 to deal with agrarian protest, labour movement mobilisation, illegal distilling and general banditry. In County Clare, the Special Infantry Corps were based out of the County Club in Ennis. But there was an effort for them to have as much of a presence as possible in the Kilfenora, Lemena area, which was one of the major centre of cattle drives and illegal grazing. So I'm here at what was the formal entrance to the O'Callaghan Westropp domain at Maryfort near Tulla. And it's fine cut stone, it's a work of some craftsmanship, and now it sits adjacent to a farmyard because the O'Callaghan Westropp domain was taken over and redistributed by the Land Commission. George O'Callaghan Westropp's father was the author of the notorious Bodyke evictions. But perhaps surprisingly, George O'Callaghan Westropp was a farmers' leader, a leader of the Irish Farmers' Union, one of a number of landlords or ex-landlords in the upper ranks of the Irish Farmers' Union. The Irish Farmers' Union newspaper, the Irish Free State Farmer, described its members as the people who survived the stranglehold of war and revolution. And in many ways, they were a conservative force in the Ireland of the 1920s. Here, there's two areas known as Knocklar and Knockbrack on the O'Callaghan estate, or they were on the O'Callaghan estate. One is a valley where 200 years ago there was a clock on, which is a hamlet where land was held collectively through the Rundale system. There was an infield where people had their tillage plots and an outfield for summer grazing. That system was broken up by the estate in the early 19th century. People were given individual holdings. Some people were sent up into the mountain. Beyond the valley where the hamlet was, there's a long, low ridge that was in a large grazing farm. The large grazing farm was broken up and redistributed to smallholders by state intervention in the years running up to the First World War. The fact that the O'Callaghan Westropp estate, much of the lands on it, had been redistributed by the state in the early 20th century, prior to the high points of the Irish Revolution, goes some way to explaining why there was less contention on the O'Callaghan Westropp estate in 1920, 1921, 1922 by comparison to the O'Brien estate or the McNamara estate. So these are heritage breeds of cattle. Your Aberdeen Angus, your Belted Galloway and your Whitehead or your Hereford. Now, the first thing you might notice with that is that they're all referring to counties in Britain. The Aberdeen Angus from Aberdeenshire, the Belted Galloway from Galloway in the southwest of Scotland, and the Hereford from Herefordshire in the west of England. Now, there's a history to that because these are cattle bred for beef. And in the 17th century, the Irish beef trade was restricted in the interests of beef producers in Scotland, the west of England and Wales. There was then more of an emphasis in Ireland towards dairy and towards the salted meat provisions trade, especially focused in Munster. So Irish traditional breeds then tend to be dairy or what's known as dual use beef or dairy. So as well as considering the relationships within Ireland, social relationships of gender and class, we also have to consider relationships between Ireland and the wider world and how these different relationships condition each other. I'm talking a lot about class vis-a-vis tenant farmers and landlords, or vis-a-vis agricultural labourers and tenant farmers, but we also have to consider the other C, colonialism, and how Irish society was incorporated into a British-dominated Atlantic economy and later a world economy. So what I have here on my tablet is a threatening letter to do with the O'Brien estate. It's addressed from Newmarket and Fergus, and it's addressed to Lord Inchiquin. Lord Inchiquin, that's the title of Lucius O'Brien. Okay? I'm not going to read out this threatening letter because it tells us something of the time as it appeared to people who lived in the time. To Lord Inchiquin, we beg to draw your attention to the following. 1. A land settlement bill is to be introduced in the Dáil immediately. 2. The bill is to be final and the landless men of the country are to be provided for. 3. You hold 2,000 acres at home. 4. All other land in your possession outside this must be at once sold to the new commissioners. We bear you no enmity, but failing this we shall take the following steps. 1. No rent will be allowed to be paid to you. 2. No man unless at his own peril will be allowed to graze your lands. Neither will we allow yourself to graze the lands. 3. No man will be allowed either to graze or meadow the lands you now let by auction. 4. Your own life and that of your family will be made unbearable, and those threats we mean as no idle ones. We will see they are carried through, peace or not. The youth of Ireland will see to it that they are no longer humbugged, and the day of the recruiting sergeant and the emigrant ship are things of the past. Your late bodyguard won't ensure your protection should you fail in your duty to us and your country, by order of the landless men. So what does this letter tell us? It tells us that for some people, the Irish Revolution meant something more than replacing a government in London with a government in Dublin. But the landless men we're talking about in the so-called threatening letter is the lived experience of colonialism in terms of the reign of the recruiting sergeant and the emigrant ship. They're also talking about the 1923 Land Act, which, in terms of its provisions of compulsory purchase of landed estates and in terms of the widespread land redistribution it led to, might be said to be the culmination of the land question and the solution of the land question. But they're also raising the question, who gets the land that's being redistributed? Is it themselves, who they portray as the sons of rack-rented tenants whose alternative is the recruiting sergeant or the emigrant ship? Or is it people that they see as holding large tracts of land from the O'Brien estate already? So we might say that this isn't just a land question, it is in fact a class question.